Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, welcoming you to this compilation of the most interesting mysteries from the great state of Florida that I covered in 2025. Before we start, remember to like and leave a comment, and also hit that share button and send this video to your friends and family. On May 29th, 1982, a gruesome discovery was made in a remote area of Loxahatchee, Florida. In a shallow grave, investigators found a green nylon bag containing the skeletal remains of a young female. The condition of the remains immediately indicated foul play. Crucially, the perpetrator had sliced off the victim's fingertips, an apparent attempt to prevent identification. This chilling detail led detectives to initially believe that the perpetrator likely knew the victim and feared being linked to the crime if her body were identified. At the scene, authorities also recovered personal items, a digital watch and a pair of handmade post-type earrings, crafted from 2 pennies minted in 1979. Local law enforcement and the medical examiner began working to learn who this young woman was and what had happened to her. The Palm Beach County medical examiner examined the remains, which were in an advanced state of decomposition, and noted no immediate cause of death on the skeleton. The manner of death was presumed to be a slaying given the circumstances, and investigators combed through the additional clues, but nothing turned up. The location was semi-rural and sparsely developed at the time, offering the perp the seclusion to hide the crime. Investigators painstakingly compared the recovered skeletal profile against over 1,000 missing person cases nationwide, hoping to find a match, but every comparison came up empty. With no identity and no witnesses, the case of this Loxahatchee Jane Doe grew cold, and the victim remained nameless for many years. Unbeknownst to Palm Beach County authorities, about 18 months before the Loxahatchee remains were found, a 17-year-old girl named Tina Beebe had vanished. Tina was living with her family in the Fort Myers area when, on January 20th, 1981, she suddenly went missing. In the days before her disappearance, Tina had shared an excited story with her older sister, Holly. According to a later interview with Holly, Tina came home and excitedly told her sister that she had met a big-time modeling scout. This man had approached Tina with the promise of a job as a model, a dream opportunity for the teenager. Tina left home, ostensibly to pursue this offer, and her family never saw her again. At the time, Tina's disappearance was a mystery. There were no obvious signs of abduction at her home, and friends initially wondered if she might have run off to start a modeling career. Tina's family were convinced something was wrong. A dark development soon appeared to confirm the family's fears. The day after Tina vanished, one of her acquaintances was brutally slain. Tina had been friends with 27-year-old Harvey Michael McElroy, a known enforcer for a local gang who had recently escaped prison. McElroy was found slain, and his body burned in an apparent gangland slaying. This raised disturbing questions about Tina's fate. Investigators in Southwest Florida considered the possibility that Tina might have gotten entangled in McElroy's dangerous world. There was even speculation that Tina had been working for McElroy, perhaps in some illicit capacity, and that the same gang may have eliminated her to tie up loose ends. Notably, this gang had a reputation for extreme violence and was also confirmed to have slain numerous other people in the area at the time. These leads were tenuous and difficult to prove, but they show that early on, law enforcement did consider a gang connection in Tina Beebe's case. Still, with no body and no solid evidence of what happened to Tina in 1981, her case in Fort Myers went cold, much like the unidentified remains case did in Palm Beach County. For decades, the mystery of the Loxahatchee Jane Doe and the disappearance of Tina Beebe remained unsolved puzzles running in parallel, unknown to each other. By the early 2000s, The unidentified remains from Loxahatchee were stored among dozens of other cold cases at the Palm Beach County Medical Examiner's Office. In 2013, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office decided to take a fresh look at its Jane Doe cases. A forensic artist began creating facial reconstructions and circulating details in hopes of generating new leads. One day, Holly, Tina's sister, happened to hear about an unidentified female body found on Florida's East Coast years ago. Holly's intuition immediately told her this could be her sister. She immediately rushed into action and contacted the sheriff's office to explain about Tina. When Holly reached an investigator and began describing her sister's case, the officer realized exactly which cold case she was referring to. Holly sent the sheriff's office a photograph of Tina, and the forensic artist compared it to the skull of the Jane Doe he had worked with to create the sketch. The skull's facial structure showed a unique asymmetry, which appeared to be shared by Tina. Experts also noted that the Jane Doe's teeth and Tina's dental records lined up perfectly. After 31 years of anonymity, the young woman in the shallow grave finally had a name. In July 2013, authorities officially confirmed that the Loxahatchee remains were identified as Tina Marie Beebe, who had been just 17 years old at the time. They now knew for certain Tina had been deceased all those years. But this gave rise to two important questions. Who had slain her, and why? With Tina Beebe's identity restored, detectives could finally piece together her last known movements and pursue suspects. The circumstances of her disappearance immediately drew attention to one infamous criminal, Christopher Wilder. Wilder was an Australian-American serial perpetrator who lived in South Florida and in 1984 embarked on a cross-country crime spree targeting young women. He would pose as a photographer or modeling agent to lure victims with promises of careers, then abduct them and commit horrific acts to them. In the span of early 1984, Wilder ended the lives of at least 8 women across the U.S. before he died in a police shootout. Since his death, Wilder has been suspected in numerous unsolved cases of young women, especially those who had modeling or acting aspirations. Several facts in Tina's case point eerily toward Wilder's modus operandi. Tina disappeared after telling her sister about a man offering her a modeling job, which is exactly the kind of bait Wilder used on his victims. Additionally, Tina's remains were found not far from a property in Loxahatchee, which Wilder owned. In fact, just months after Tina's body was discovered, another potential victim of his, Leona Keller, was found in the same area. Notably, though, it's important to remember that Leona herself has never been conclusively tied to Wilder. It's important to note that Wilder was active in Florida from 1981 to 1984, and Tina's case fits a pattern. However, all the confirmed cases associated with him are from 1984, though the authorities suspect he had engaged in his sick predation for many years longer. If Wilder was indeed responsible for Tina's slaying, any real justice will be elusive, given the fact that he's been deceased for decades. The other theory that has lingered is the earlier gang connection. Was Tina collateral damage in a criminal underworld feud? Tina's friendship with Harvey McElroy and the timing of his gang-related slaying raised suspicions that she might have been silenced by the same crew in January 1981. The fact that Tina's fingers were chopped to hide her identity potentially suggests a gangland slaying by people who were concerned she would be tied back to McElroy. Further yet, Christopher Wilder wasn't known to have committed this act with his other victims, despite committing unspeakable horrors towards them. However, the gang theory is largely speculative and has never been proven. No direct evidence tying the gang to Tina's death has surfaced publicly. From my perspective, the theory involving Christopher Wilder feels far more convincing. The evidence of Tina's sister is simply too strong to ignore. Wilder was infamous for exactly that method, using the irresistible promise of modeling contracts to lure young women into his trap. It's eerie to think Tina excitedly shared this opportunity with her sister, completely unaware she was likely speaking to the man who would end her life the next day. The timing aligns so perfectly that it's hard to overlook. Wilder lived in Florida at the exact same period, living essentially next to the property where her body was found. Additionally, the location where Tina's remains were found further strengthens this suspicion. That said, the location of Tina's remains could have been a coincidence. Further, it's always possible that someone else who meant to do her harm also promised her a modeling gig, perhaps in an attempt to get Tina in an isolated one-on-one setting. That is to say, promising someone a modeling job isn't the most unique modus operandi in existence. In fact, the idea is so common that the idea of a creepy guy posing as a modeling agent or photographer has become a common trope in pop culture. In July 1990, the headless and handless body of 34-year-old Beverly Ann McGowan was discovered on a remote canal bank in southern Florida. Her gruesome fate shocked investigators and the public, not only for its brutality, but for the audacious con artist behind it. In early July 1990, Beverly McGowan placed a classified ad in the Sun Sentinel newspaper seeking a female roommate for her two-bedroom condo. A well-dressed British woman calling herself Alice responded, claiming to be an IBM employee transferred to Fort Lauderdale. Beverly's friends and family recall how quickly Alice charmed her. She spoke with a refined English accent and introduced Beverly to the idea of numerology, which in this case involved using personal numbers to predict one's future. Beverly, eager to bond with her new roommate, provided Alice with personal details like her social security, driver's license, and bank account numbers, supposedly for a numerology chart. And yeah, I can already predict the comments flooding in on this aspect of the case, but I digress. Just days after Alice moved in, Beverly suddenly vanished around July 17, 1990. This abrupt disappearance alarmed her siblings. They visited her condo to find the home in disarray. Beverly's car was missing, her bed unmade with her nightgown laid out, and the phone disconnected. Oddly, her two beloved cats were gone, and personal documents such as her address book, birth certificate, and passport had also disappeared. On July 19th, friends and family received handwritten letters claiming to be from Beverly, claiming she had sold her condo and was starting a new life elsewhere. The tone sounded casual, and the handwriting initially appeared to be hers, which confused investigators because there were no obvious signs she had been forced to write the notes. That same day, however, a fisherman made a grim discovery about 100 miles away: the body of a woman dumped in a canal in St. Lucie County, Florida. The victim's head and hands had been cut off, and a tattoo on her abdomen had been removed, evidently to impede identification. Despite the perpetrator's effort to mask the victim's identity, they overlooked a small flower tattoo on the woman's ankle. Further, the removal of her head had been incomplete to the point that some dental evidence could be collected. Using the tattoo and dental records, police identified the body as Beverly McGowan. Once Beverly's remains were identified, the mysterious roommate Alice became the prime suspect. Detectives quickly surmised that the farewell letters were part of an elaborate deception to delay alarm while the perpetrator fled. Investigators began retracing Beverly's steps and soon uncovered critical evidence that pointed to identity theft and fraud. They learned that someone had been using Beverly's credit cards in the days following her slaying. In fact, a woman matching Alice's description was seen on surveillance using one of McGowan's cards to purchase items and withdraw cash. Police also found Beverly's car abandoned at Miami International Airport. Inside the car, they discovered strands of hair from a wig, suggesting a disguise. This clue proved significant when authorities learned that a person impersonating Beverly had reserved a rental car at London's Heathrow Airport around the same time. According to witnesses, a person described as a man in a woman's wig picked up the rental car using Beverly's name and identification. By now, it was clear the perpetrator had stolen Beverly's identity and left the country. Detectives checked flight manifests out of Miami and discovered that Alice had flown to England on a British Airways flight under the name Sylvia Ann Hodgkinson. This name was familiar to law enforcement, and further investigation revealed it likely belonged to an Englishwoman Alice had befriended in the past. The real Sylvia Hodgkinson has never been found, and authorities suspected she might have been an earlier victim of the same perpetrator. Through this alias, police finally uncovered Alice's apparent true identity: Elaine Parent, an apparently American con artist with a lengthy history of fraud and assumed names. Identifying Elaine Parent was a major breakthrough, but catching her proved to be an enormous challenge. Parent had already fled overseas, and she was a master at vanishing into new personas. In May 1991, Interpol agents actually apprehended Parent in London for carrying a fake passport, where she was found with identification in the names of Hodgkinson and another woman. Astonishingly, due to insufficient evidence tying her to the Florida case at that time, she was released before authorities realized who they truly had in custody. By the time Florida investigators linked forensic evidence from Beverly's car and handwriting in the condo to Parent, their suspect had slipped away again. Elaine Parent then spent the next several years hopscotching around the globe. Reports of sightings came in from all over, ranging from London, Paris, Istanbul, to parts of Australia and South Africa, but each time she managed to stay a step ahead of the law. The case grew cold, but it was never closed. In 1998, in a bizarre twist, the fugitive herself sent police a taunting message. Detectives in Florida received a package containing a photograph of an oil painting, a self-portrait of Elaine Parent. On the back, a note was typed, "Best wishes, your chameleon," referencing her chameleon-like ability to change identities. Also, unfortunately, it looks as though this oil painting has never been released to the public, as I was unable to find a copy of it anywhere online. The breakthrough finally came in April 2002, nearly 12 years after Beverly's slaying. Acting on a fresh tip, police tracked Elaine Parent to an apartment in Panama City, Florida. After evading capture for so long, Parent's luck had run out and law enforcement surrounded her residence. Even in her final moments, the 59-year-old con artist remained dramatic and unyielding. As officers stood outside her bedroom door, giving her a moment to get dressed, Parent decided to take out the trash herself. Elaine Parent died on April 6, 2002, taking with her any secrets about her motives and possible other crimes. So you may be sitting here and asking yourself where the mystery is. Well, earlier on I mentioned that Elaine Parent was apparently her real name and that she was apparently American. Investigators believe that the Elaine Parent identity may have just been another in this criminal's inception-like layers of identities. No birth certificate or other evidence has ever been found to support the existence of Elaine Parent as a real person. No family members or friends have ever been located who knew this individual her whole life to verify her identity. Some investigators believe that her claim to be an American was false, and that she was actually a British or South African woman, pretending to be an American, pretending to be a Brit. In late 2000, 52-year-old Colleen Wood was preparing to sail around the world with her new boyfriend from the shores of Fort Lauderdale. She had uprooted her life in Ohio to pursue this dream and fallen in love with a charismatic man named John Paul. Paul was a former race car driver turned investor who promised her an exciting life of travel on the open seas. But just as their voyage was set to begin, Colleen vanished without a trace. The adventure of a lifetime had turned into a chilling mystery that remains unsolved till this day. Colleen met John Paul in 1999, and he presented himself as a Harvard-educated businessman and former race car champion. And just to be clear, John Paul was actually a Harvard-educated race car driver who owned his own team, called JLP Racing, back in the 70s and 80s. But as you'll see shortly, his subsequent businesses were much less legitimate. Colleen and John's romance progressed quickly, and by early 2000, the couple planned a 5-year sailing voyage around the globe on John's 55-foot schooner. The boat, originally named the Island Girl, became their home as Colleen quit her job and sold her condominium to join him. She even entrusted John with $43,000 from the sale of her condo to invest for their future together. Colleen was all in on this dream, ready to cast off for a new life at sea. The final confirmed communications from Colleen came in early December 2000, and they gave no hint of trouble. On December 3, 2000, she called her son in Ohio to say that she and John would be setting sail in a few weeks, and that she'd be in touch again soon. About 10 days later, on December 13th, a friend invited Colleen to a Christmas party. Colleen answered that call from Key West, where she was out enjoying herself with John, and she sounded happy and excited for the journey ahead. She promised her friend she would return to Fort Lauderdale for the party. That was the last anyone heard from Colleen. She never showed up to the holiday gathering she agreed to attend, and more alarmingly, she failed to call her family over Christmas. This was a time she would never miss contacting her 2 grown sons, whom she was extremely close to. By the first week of 2001, her loved ones were deeply concerned. Colleen's cell phone had been disconnected, and all calls went unanswered. It seemed that Colleen had disappeared into thin air. As the search for Colleen began, unsettling facts about John Paul's past came to light. The charming sailor who had swept Colleen off her feet was hiding a history of serious crime. John Paul was a convicted felon who had spent over a decade in prison in the 1980s for activities related to the smuggling of street pharmaceuticals into the United States. However, this didn't even begin to scratch the surface of what John Paul had done. He had once pumped his former associate full of lead, and only through sheer fortune did that man survive. For his crimes, he received 20 years in the slammer and ended up serving most of his sentence. John had only been out on parole for roughly a year when he met Colleen, a fact that wasn't known to her. After all, 5-year boat trips around the world aren't generally compliant with the terms of most people's probation. Disturbingly, Colleen wasn't the first woman close to John to vanish under mysterious circumstances. Back in 1981, John's then-wife had disappeared during a trip to the Florida Keys and was never found. John was considered a suspect in that case, though no charges were filed. This pattern, a woman in John's life vanishing without explanation, cast a dark shadow over Colleen's disappearance. With Colleen missing, the Fort Lauderdale police opened an investigation in early 2001. John Paul initially cooperated when detectives questioned him in May 2001. He claimed that he and Colleen had a fight over money in mid-December 2000, and that Colleen decided to leave him. She had supposedly returned with a couple of tough-looking male friends to grab her belongings before departing for good. John also reportedly told a slightly different story to his own daughter. He told her that Colleen had been upset about some issue involving one of his ex-girlfriends and had broken off the relationship over that. These inconsistent accounts raised eyebrows, and nothing about John's explanations convincingly accounted for why Colleen would drop out of contact completely. Before long, evidence surfaced that made John's stories look even more dubious. Investigators discovered that between mid-December 2000 and February 2001, nearly $40,000 was withdrawn from Colleen's bank accounts. These withdrawals were clearly not made by Colleen, as grainy surveillance images showed other people at the ATMs. Police later identified at least 2 women who had been using Colleen's bank cards during that period. When questioned, those individuals admitted that a man named John had given them Colleen's bank card and PIN, instructing them to pull out cash on his behalf. In other words, John Paul was siphoning off Colleen's money after she vanished, using intermediaries to cover his tracks. Another red flag appeared when detectives found that someone had used Colleen's credit card to place 2 unusual classified ads in a local Florida newspaper in December 2000. One ad was soliciting a first mate for a boat, and the other was a personal ad from a man seeking a female companion. Both ads were paid for with Colleen's card and were placed around the time Colleen went missing. It looked like the person responsible for her disappearance was already trying to recruit a replacement crew member and also find a new love interest. This chilling discovery strongly suggested that Colleen's departure was not voluntary or accidental. As evidence mounted, John Paul didn't stick around. By summer 2001, he had quietly sailed away from Fort Lauderdale on his ship now named the Diamond Girl, violating the terms of his parole in the process and becoming a fugitive. Detectives announced that while John was not officially named a suspect due to lack of physical evidence, they urgently wanted to find and question him again about Colleen's disappearance. Over the following years, there were scattered sightings of John Paul in various exotic locales. Investigators heard reports that he was in the Caribbean. For example, he was rumored to have been seen in Jamaica shortly after fleeing Florida. Later, a passerby in Fiji claimed to recognize him from Unsolved Mysteries. By 2009, authorities received information that John and his yacht had turned up in Thailand, where he talked about starting a diving business. Not long after, John Paul sold the Diamond Girl in 2011 and disappeared once more, effectively going off the radar. To this day, John Paul has never been apprehended, and now in his early 80s, his exact whereabouts remain unknown. More than 2 decades later, Colleen Wood's fate remains unsolved, but the evidence overwhelmingly points to foul play by John Paul. Without a body or direct proof of a crime, authorities could never charge John for Colleen's disappearance. However, those close to the case believe that John likely eliminated Colleen and disposed of her body, perhaps at sea somewhere near the Florida Keys, where they were last together. The pattern of John draining Colleen's accounts and immediately seeking another companion suggests a calculated crime rather than any sort of accident. On September 22, 1972, 13-year-old Gail Joyner returned home from school in Thonotosassa, Florida, ate a sandwich, and then headed out to walk her pet raccoon, Bandit, on a leash. She strolled barefoot down the rural road near her home and was never seen again. Multiple witnesses later reported seeing Gail that afternoon standing by a white car near a wooded area, speaking with an unidentified person. However, no one saw her actually enter the vehicle. When Gail didn't return home, her family grew concerned and contacted the authorities. She had left behind her shoes and all her personal belongings, strengthening fears that she hadn't run away voluntarily. Gail's parents insisted to the police she wouldn't have left on her own. After all, she was happy at home and very close to her siblings. Early on, the authorities suspected foul play. Perhaps someone had lured the friendly girl by showing interest in Bandit, a pet she loved to show off to anyone who asked. As night fell on September 22nd, a search effort began and intensified over the next days. Law enforcement and volunteers mobilized a massive search of the area. More than 150 people scoured the woods and roads on foot and horseback, and helicopters flew over the surrounding terrain. Divers and deputies also searched local waterways, including nearby Lake Thonotosasa, in case Gail or her pet had fallen in. A very odd tip came in on September 25th, 1972, that gave a glimmer of hope from a woman driving in the area. This witness reported seeing a girl matching Gail's description, wandering near an orange grove wearing nothing but sheets of newspaper. For reasons that make no sense to me, the woman didn't stop to approach the girl immediately. Investigators rushed to that area, but they found no sign of Gail or whoever the girl was. By the end of that first week, authorities publicly acknowledged what everyone feared. They believed Gail had been abducted by an unknown individual. Witnesses had described the suspicious car as a small white 1960s Chevy sedan or similar model. They also described a possible suspect, who was described as a young white male in his mid to late 20s, with short dark hair and long sideburns, seen leaning against the car in the area. With these leads, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office pursued tips and conducted interviews, but progress was painfully slow. Investigators even went so far as to collect 17 raccoon carcasses found in the vicinity, hoping one might be Bandit, which had identifiable scars on his foot and nose. Unfortunately, Gail's family did not recognize any of them as her pet, eliminating that potential trail. As weeks turned into months, the case grew cold. No suspect was identified, and no body or physical evidence turned up. Within a month of Gail's disappearance, active investigative efforts were scaled back due to the lack of new leads. A decade later, an unexpected development briefly renewed hope. In October 1982, convicted serial perpetrator Gerald Stano, who was already behind bars in Florida, confessed to slaying Gail. Stano was a notorious predator who had confessed to slaying dozens of young women across several states. In fact, he claimed responsibility for as many as 41 slayings, though only 23 were ever confirmed. As part of his 1982 confession, Stano provided details about Gail's case, and even pointed investigators to a location where he said he had left her remains. In January 1983, he was transported to Hillsborough County to assist in the search, and he led deputies to an area about a mile from where Gail was last seen. For a moment, it seemed like the mystery might finally be solved. Despite this dramatic turn, the outcome was disappointing. A thorough search of the spot he identified turned up nothing. There were no remains and no evidence connected to Gail. Subsequently, Stano abruptly recanted his confession. Investigators were left uncertain whether Stano had truly been involved or if he was fabricating the story. Stano was known to confess to crimes he had no direct link to, and authorities have noted that at least some of his many admissions were dubious or outright false. In Gail's case, detectives remarked that Stano did know certain details that only the perpetrator would know, which lent some credibility to his account. However, without any physical evidence, they couldn't verify his claims. Stano was never charged in connection with Gail Joyner's disappearance, and he was eliminated in 1998 for his other disturbing acts. Some have theorized that he may have interacted with the real individual responsible for Gail's disappearance while in prison, which is why he had some but not all of the details. Further observers have noted that Gail would have been an extremely significant outlier in terms of the age of his victims. Most of Stano's victims were in their late teens or early adulthood, and none of his confirmed victims were near Gail's age. In the absence of a definitive resolution, several theories have shaped public understanding of what happened to Gail Joyner. The prevailing belief, supported by investigators and the family, is that Gail was the victim of an abductor who likely exploited her trust. The detail of Bandit, the pet raccoon, is often highlighted in discussions of the case. It's believed that the abductor may have approached Gail under friendly pretenses, perhaps asking about or playing with the raccoon, which would have lowered the young girl's guard. This theory aligns with the family's statements that Gail was a trusting girl who loved to share her unusual pet with others. It also fits the evidence of her being seen conversing by the road with someone just before she vanished. Personally, this is a case I want to see solved in a big way, and I hope that I can bring more attention to Gail Joyner's case. Given the age of the potential suspect, the monster who did this is potentially still alive and well, and may be living free. Apprehending the person responsible would also allow Gail's family to finally have closure after more than 50 years. On a calm September night in 1989, at a convenience store along a lonely highway in North Florida, 36-year-old Darlene Messer vanished without a trace. 2 days later, a railroad conductor crossing a small bridge made a horrifying discovery. Darlene's crumpled body lay face down in the shallow water below. Her face had been beaten so savagely that identification was nearly impossible, and it was later determined that Darlene had been abducted from her workplace and brutally eliminated. This is the haunting story of what happened to Darlene Messer and the enduring mystery that continues to this day. Darlene was a 36-year-old mother originally from Calgary in Canada. In 1987, she moved to Florida to be near a prison pen pal, Charles Messer, who would soon become her husband. Charles was imprisoned for slaying an individual during a robbery and was actually scheduled to get the big state-sponsored DP. According to those who knew Darlene, she knew about the nature of his criminal offenses, but she had been led to believe that he was going to get paroled. I'm guessing she didn't know too much about Florida justice, but hey, it was the 80s. By that year, Darlene was living in Lake City and working the overnight shift at a convenience store. Her mother was visiting from Canada at the time, completely unaware of the tragedy about to unfold. Late on September 18, 1989, Darlene was behind the counter on her usual graveyard shift. Shortly after midnight, a couple from Georgia stopped in around 12:35 for coffee and snacks. They stayed for about 15 minutes, and as they left, they nearly collided with an incoming vehicle, an older rust-colored Pontiac Grand Prix. This was the last car seen at the store before everything went wrong. At about 12:55 a.m., minutes after that mystery car arrived, the store's silent alarm went off. Police rushed to the scene and found the place empty and chaotic. Around $100 was missing from the register, and money and goods were strewn across the floor, and Darlene was gone. She was packing a Roscoe in her purse, but it appeared that the weapon was simply too far away from her. This suggested that this was a violent and sudden abduction. A frantic search began for the missing clerk almost immediately, with her mother attempting to help in any way she could. 2 days later, on September 20th, a train conductor passing over a bridge about 13 miles from the store spotted a body in the shallow water below. Authorities found Darlene lying face down in water under the bridge. She was fully clothed but missing one shoe, as well as a necklace and an earring. These are items that were potentially lost in the struggle, or potentially dark souvenirs taken by the predator. She had been beaten, possibly with a hammer, and the blows to her face were so severe she was almost unrecognizable. I don't usually get into the gruesome details, but here it's important since some have suggested that this hints at a personal grudge against Darlene. And keep that in mind, because there were two men who definitely had some serious hatred of her, but I'll get to that in a moment. Evidence on the bridge indicated she was probably eliminated there and her body thrown into the creek afterward. Investigators also noted an oil stain on the bridge, possibly left by the perp's vehicle. Detectives began piecing together leads. The couple who last saw Darlene described the car they encountered, but they couldn't see the driver. 10 days before the slaying, Darlene had reported two suspicious men lurking around the convenience store's parking lot. Police responded and arrested the pair, who were armed. These men, known as Bob and Roger, were former co-workers of Darlene's. She had even reported them for theft at a previous job, suggesting a grudge. When they were arrested, Bob and Roger were driving a rust-colored Grand Prix that leaked oil, eerily similar to the car and clues in Darlene's case. Further, the very personal way in which Darlene was eliminated by the perpetrator or perpetrators does suggest a grudge may have been at play, and Bob and Roger definitely had one. Investigators focused on these two men, and both denied involvement and claimed they were nowhere near Lake City that night. Ultimately, forensic evidence at the scene suggested they weren't solely responsible. That said, the authorities have speculated that they may have had help from another man, explaining why the forensic situation doesn't line up neatly, and they've never been cleared. Another lead pointed to a 31-year-old man arrested in Gainesville for a string of convenience store robberies around that time. A witness had reported seeing a blue car with a woman screaming near Lake City on the night Darlene disappeared, and this suspect drove a blue car. He also had a violent past, and his own wife reportedly made statements implicating him. Police impounded his vehicle, but found nothing to tie him to Darlene's abduction. Given Darlene's unusual personal life, detectives considered her husband as well. Charles Messer was in prison at the time, and some speculated he orchestrated an attack from prison out of jealousy. This theory never gained traction, and police found no evidence for it, and believed Charles had no role in his wife's death. Others have speculated that her connection to Messer may have made her a target. Under this line of reasoning, she may have been targeted by someone who Messer wronged, either in his criminal career or inside prison. Ultimately, however, there's no proof of this, despite how intriguing the theory may be. In December 1980, hunters in a Florida forest stumbled upon a shallow grave, unaware they had just uncovered the tragic conclusion to a family mystery. Bones lay scattered in the underbrush, disturbed by wildlife, and for decades the victim's identity remained unknown. Meanwhile, a family in Texas was left with agonizing questions after their daughter Carol Skidmore vanished during a 1977 road trip. Now nearly half a century later, modern DNA technology and detective work have finally given Carol's story a potentially solved ending. Carol Skidmore was a 26-year-old wife and mother from Sealy, Texas. On March 29, 1977, she set off on an interstate trip with her husband, James Skidmore, and her 5-year-old son, Lynn Dale Mahaffey. The couple hoped the journey to visit James's parents in Rossville, Georgia, would help mend their troubled one-year marriage. Carol's family grew concerned when weeks passed with only one brief phone call. On April 9, 1977, Carol told her parents she wasn't sure when they'd be back, a sign that all was not well. That was the last time anyone heard her voice and confirmed that she was alive. What followed was a string of grim discoveries spanning multiple states. In May 1977, the body of a young boy was found floating in Parksville Lake, Tennessee. He was wrapped in plastic and weighed down with heavy rock, indicating obvious signs of a deliberate drowning. Investigators suspected it might be Carol's son, Lynn, and sadly, the FBI confirmed the boy's identity in June 1977. Just as that confirmation came, another shock. On June 1st, 1977, James Skidmore was found deceased in a motel room in Harrison, Arkansas. Based on the evidence, it was determined that he was responsible for that specific act, and he left behind a note talking about his regrets in general terms. With James deceased and Lynn's slaying now evident, investigators launched a desperate search for Carol, but she was nowhere to be found. For a time, Carol Skidmore became a missing person case, her fate a haunting question mark for her loved ones and law enforcement alike. Unbeknownst to Carol's family, The answer to her disappearance had already been unearthed by chance 3 years after she vanished. In December 1980, three hunters trekking through woods near Fountain in Florida came across human skeletal remains in a shallow grave. The remains had been there long enough that animals had disturbed the site, scattering some of the bones around the forest floor. Investigators with the Bay County Sheriff's Office were called in and noted signs of foul play, including damage to the clothing found with the skeleton. The body was sent for forensic examination, and she was ruled out as being a number of local missing women. For the next 45 years, the two cases, Carol's 1977 disappearance and the unidentified remains found in 1980, lingered in limbo. Carol was officially listed as a missing person in Georgia and Texas, and her family held out hope for answers. Over the years, relatives provided DNA samples to databases, praying for a match if her body was ever found. In Florida, detectives periodically revisited the Jane Doe file from Bay County, but with the forensic technology of the 20th century, there was little they could do. The cases of Carol Skidmore and the nameless remains in Fountain existed in parallel, but it would take leaps in forensic science to prove any connection between the two. In 2023, the Cold Case Unit took a fresh look at the Fountain Jane Doe. The remains were exhumed, and a crucial piece of evidence, one of the victim's teeth, was submitted to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for DNA testing. Extracting DNA from a decades-old tooth was challenging, but the lab successfully developed a DNA profile unique to the unknown woman. This profile was then uploaded to the CODIS system, a national database of DNA profiles, and the breakthrough came almost immediately. Two individuals in Texas had genetic markers in common with the mystery woman. These two people turned out to be siblings who, years earlier, had volunteered their biological data in hopes of finding their missing sister. That sister was Carol Skidmore, who had vanished in 1977. With the identity confirmed, investigators could finally piece together the full story of what happened to Carol. The evidence now painted a tragic picture consistent with what detectives long suspected. Carol had been slain back in 1977, likely at the hands of her own husband. Bay County Sheriff's officials believe James Skidmore eliminated his wife and then buried her body in that shallow grave in Florida. At some point, he also did the same to little Lynn, dumping his weighted-down body in a Tennessee lake before James himself perished in that motel room. At present, this theory remains all but confirmed, though police are still attempting to put all the pieces of the puzzle together and determine if others were involved. 16-year-old Amber Cates from Columbia, Tennessee, planned to spend her spring break visiting relatives in Florida. On April 11, 2004, Amber was dropped off at her mother's house, expecting to leave for the trip that day. Instead, a friend arrived to pick her up, and Amber rode away with him, never to be seen again. By all accounts, Amber was a bright and spirited teenager, but Amber had also begun to test boundaries. She was hanging out with older, questionable friends and is believed to have occasionally indulged in illicit substances. When she vanished that spring day, what initially seemed like a potential runaway case soon turned into something far more troubling. Now, more than 20 years later, Amber's disappearance remains an unsolved mystery that haunts her community and family. In early April 2004, Amber was living with her older half-sister Brenda, who had just become Amber's legal guardian a few days earlier. Brenda was trying to provide stability for Amber after a difficult few years. Their father had died around 1999, and Amber had spent time in foster care and lived in multiple states before returning to Tennessee. That spring, Amber made plans to visit a relative in Panama City, Florida, for a short vacation during spring break. On April 11th, 2004, which was Easter Sunday, Brenda dropped Amber off at their mother Trudy's home in Columbia so Amber could depart from there for her trip. However, Amber never actually left town with any relative. Instead, a 20-year-old man named James Gordon arrived that day to pick her up. Gordon was described as Amber's friend, and possibly her boyfriend at the time. Amber climbed into the car with him, telling family she would be back in 2 days, and the pair drove off. She didn't pack as if she were running away for good. It appeared to be just a quick spring break outing. That was the last time Amber's family ever saw her. When 2 days passed and Amber failed to return or call, her family grew worried. They soon discovered that Amber had never arrived in Florida at all. On April 13th or 14th, 2004, Amber's family filed a missing persons report with local authorities. At first, police considered the possibility that Amber had run away on her own, and based on Amber's history, they assumed she was a runaway. But Amber's family insisted she wouldn't just disappear without contacting anyone. Indeed, as days went by with no word from Amber, signs began to point to something more sinister than a teenage runaway case. Her cell phone showed no activity and her bank account showed no withdrawals, two facts which strongly indicated that she hadn't planned any sort of disappearance. The timeline of Amber's last known movements would soon raise even more red flags. According to what James Gordon told police, he and Amber spent some time together in Columbia on the day she disappeared. Gordon claimed that after he picked Amber up, he later dropped her off with another friend of his that evening. This other friend was 39-year-old Ronald Inzuriaga. It's unclear how well Amber herself knew Inzuriaga. He was a much older man with an extremely serious and violent criminal background. He had been convicted of SA in 1992 and spent several years in prison. What is known is that Amber somehow ended up in Inzuriaga's company after leaving with Gordon. Police immediately tried to locate this man, but ran into dead ends, and ultimately, it took 3 years to track him down. The story Ronald later gave would be the last known trace of Amber. He said that he and Amber went to lunch at a Waffle House on James Campbell Boulevard in Columbia. They then stopped so Amber could buy some hair dye, and finally he dropped her off at a garage that was a local hangout spot for teens. It was at that garage, Inzuriaga claimed, that Amber completely disappeared. Curiously, no witnesses have ever definitively confirmed seeing her at the garage, despite that location being the last place she was reported to be. Over the years, several theories have been proposed by law enforcement, by Amber's family, and by community members to explain what might have happened on that April day in 2004. The earliest credible theory was the idea that she was a runaway. However, given that she never contacted friends and family further at any point in the last 2 decades, and given that her social security number was never used, this is considered unlikely. Another theory that has been discussed is that Amber could have fallen victim to trafficking or some form of exploitation. This idea arose mainly because of Amber's age and the circumstances. She was a 16-year-old girl out with older men, one of whom had an extremely disturbing past. While this theory remains plausible, there's nothing beyond the initial circumstantial evidence to support it. Crucially, despite over 2 decades having passed, there have been no sightings of her whatsoever. By and large, the most credible theory in Amber Cates's disappearance is that she met with foul play at the hands of the individuals she was last seen with. The suspicious sequence of events on April 11th, 2004 raises many questions, and just allow me to very briefly sum up how shady this is. One adult man picks up a troubled 16-year-old girl, then hands her off to another even older adult man, who happens to be on a very bad registry, later that same day. The second man, the dude on the registry hanging around with the troubled 16-year-old girl, claims he simply dropped said girl off, and claims no knowledge beyond that. Oh yeah, and also no one saw her at the popular hangout where she was supposedly dropped off. Literally everything about that detour in Colombia seems suspect. It's also necessary to ask, why was a 16-year-old girl, quote-unquote, friends with a 39-year-old like this guy in the first place? Further, it's been questioned to what extent the two of them even knew each other, with the source that they were friends being James Gordon, another questionable individual. Ronald's background makes it hard not to consider him a prime suspect in whatever befell Amber. To be clear, neither man has ever been charged in connection with the case, and both have denied wrongdoing. In August 2000, a routine construction dig in Ocala, Florida, turned into a crime scene when workers uncovered a human skeleton hidden inside a red sleeping bag. The remains were buried on Southwest 12th Street, alongside discarded alcohol cans and bottles. It was a shocking find, a makeshift grave in the heart of Marion County, and it marked the beginning of a mystery that endures to this day. This anonymous victim, soon dubbed the Marion County John Doe, has remained unidentified for over 25 years. The Ocala Public Works crew that found the skeleton immediately alerted police. The fact that it was wrapped in a sleeping bag and deliberately covered with soil raised immediate suspicions of foul play. Forensic examination determined the deceased was a white male around 45 to 60 years old and stood about 5'7". He had no identification on him, so examiners had to rely on physical clues. Notably, he was missing most of his teeth and had a distinct gap between his upper front teeth. This unusual dental profile was publicized in case it matched someone's long-lost relative or friend, but no hits have been made so far. The skeleton also showed evidence of past injuries, which the authorities believed could be used to identify the man. Several ribs and the nose had been broken at some point, and a foot bone had a healed fracture. Notably, these injuries were healed, and for the broken nose, it was likely that he had sought medical intervention. Notably, investigators didn't find any evidence of any significant acute trauma on his remains. However, given the clandestine burial, the Ocala Police Department treated the case as a likely slaying right from the start. Along with the bones, detectives collected the man's clothing and belongings for clues. The John Doe was found with multiple layers of clothes on his body, including black sweatpants, blue jeans, and a pair of green sweats. The odd combination of wearing several pairs of pants suggests he may have been living outdoors and carrying his entire wardrobe on his person. If you're a regular viewer of my channel, you'll probably already know this practice is often seen among homeless individuals who wear all their layers both for warmth and convenience. Notably, a generic Wilson wristwatch was still on his wrist, and the red sleeping bag likely served as his bedding. These personal items paint a picture of a man living rough, camping out in an empty lot, or perhaps living out in the woods. Based on the condition of the remains, experts estimated that the man died anywhere from 8 months to 5 years before he was found. In other words, he likely perished sometime in the mid-1990s through late 1999, a massive span of time that gave the perpetrator a huge head start. Whoever buried him in that unused plot managed to keep the secret until development work unearthed it by chance. Notably, DNA analysis, often the trump card in modern cold cases, has been problematic here. No usable DNA profile could be obtained from the remains due to severe degradation. Without a DNA profile, advanced forensic genealogy techniques can't be applied yet to hunt down relatives. Instead, investigators have relied on traditional detective work and public outreach. Over the years, forensic artists created composite images reconstructing the man's face, and these have been circulated through media and police channels. Notably, it's unclear to me if the John Doe's remains have been preserved and sent for modern forensic testing. This would allow the authorities to search the CODIS database at the very least. If successful, this would give the decedent his name back and would serve as a better starting point for actually solving the crime against him as well. Without solid leads, several theories have emerged about who this man was and how he met his end. The prevailing idea is that he was a homeless individual who fell victim to violence. Perhaps he was camping on that property and encountered trouble, such as a robbery or an altercation that turned into something way more serious. The empty liquor bottles at the scene suggest alcohol might have been involved, though given the passage of time, it's possible that these were simply incidental. That said, it's easy to imagine two people drinking together in that secluded spot and a fight breaking out, ending in tragedy. In such a scenario, the assailant may have hastily buried the body to conceal the crime. Another possibility is that the case doesn't actually involve any foul play at all. If the John Doe passed away of an overdose while with companions, those people might have panicked and buried him to avoid legal trouble. Alternatively, he may have simply perished due to natural causes, and the people with him may have done their best to give him a burial with what they had on hand. This could explain the lack of overt trauma on the remains. More speculative ideas have also been floated by amateur sleuths. It does always remain possible that a serial predator targeted this John Doe. Unfortunately, people living on the outskirts of life, like the homeless, are often targeted by these predators simply because, in general, no one will notice that they've gone missing. If a homeless person vanishes, they're generally assumed to have moved on to greener pastures, even by their own friends from the streets. Further, even when they're reported missing, generally by other homeless people, the police generally don't sink any investigative efforts into the case. For now, the Marion County John Doe remains nameless, but he's not forgotten. The hope is that one day this man's identity will be restored and the full story of what happened to him will finally come to light. On March 5th, 1974, 17-year-old Amy Billig left her home in Coconut Grove, Florida, to meet her father at his art gallery about a mile away. She often hitchhiked around the neighborhood, as was the style at the time, and that afternoon she stood by the roadside with her thumb out on the highway. Witnesses saw Amy getting into a vehicle, but she never arrived at her father's gallery and never met her friends for lunch as planned. The high school senior simply vanished without a trace, turning an ordinary day into one of Florida's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. When Amy failed to return home that evening, her mother, Susan Billig, immediately knew something was wrong. Amy had phoned earlier to say she'd be back after meeting her dad, so the family quickly reported her missing. At first, police hesitated to act, suggesting the teenager might turn up by morning. But by March 6th, a full investigation was launched. With no sign of Amy locally, a surprising clue surfaced on March 18th. Her camera was found near a highway exit, 250 miles north of Miami. The film inside yielded only one hazy photo, a light-colored pickup truck by a vine-covered wall, and no clear evidence. Investigators couldn't trace the truck or the location in the picture. Desperate for leads, her parents blanketed South Florida with missing person flyers, hired a private investigator, and held press conferences to keep Amy's story in the public eye. Despite extensive media coverage and community fundraisers to aid the search, weeks passed with no breakthrough. Early in the investigation, a disturbing theory took shape. Amy may have been abducted by an outlaw biker gang passing through the area. On the very day Amy disappeared, two notorious biker clubs, the Outlaws and the Pagans, had been traveling through Coconut Grove en route to a bike rally in Daytona Beach. Multiple tips and sightings soon tied Amy's fate to these gangs. A woman calling herself Susan Johnson phoned to claim Amy was taken by the outlaws and had been seen with bikers in Daytona. Indeed, the outlaws had ridden through Miami that day. Susan Billig even met with a couple of bikers, who initially vowed to help. However, as she kept digging, these same bikers later told her to stop looking further, fueling fears of a cover-up within the biker world. Also, telling a grieving mother looking for her daughter to stop looking at the bikers clearly just raised more suspicion. As they say, you only take flak when you're flying over the target. Credible sightings of Amy with bikers continued to emerge as time went on. In Orlando, a convenience store manager insisted he saw Amy come in with a biker group to buy vegetarian soup. This was a detail that gave Susan hope, since Amy was a vegetarian, and that fact wasn't public knowledge. The strongest lead came from within another gang. In late 1975, Paul Branch, a member of the Pagans, contacted Susan after seeing Amy's photo in a newspaper. Branch claimed he had kept Amy for a time after obtaining her from another biker, and he even described a hidden 2-inch scar on her abdomen from an appendectomy. This private detail convinced Susan that Branch had truly encountered her daughter. Disturbingly, the details suggest that she was trafficked between the bikers. For reasons that are unclear, Branch promised to help get Amy back, but his leads only sent Susan on wild goose chases. At one arranged rendezvous in Tulsa, Branch promised to bring Amy back to her family. However, he was never able to produce her, and he later claimed other bikers attacked him for cooperating. Branch subsequently cut off all communications with the family, but keep him in the back of your mind, because he's going to play another major role decades later. Despite these frustrations, both the family and police saw a biker gang abduction as the most plausible explanation for Amy's disappearance. Over the years, Amy's loved ones endured numerous hoaxes and false leads that compounded their ordeal. 16 days after Amy vanished, the Billigs received a phone call from someone claiming to have kidnapped her, demanding $30,000 ransom. The caller even let a girl scream in the background, making Susan believe for a moment that her daughter was alive. A drop-off was arranged at a Miami Beach hotel, but it turned out to be an extortion scam by 16-year-old twin boys with no connection to Amy. Unfortunately, this incident would be a harmless prank in comparison to the sinister activities of the next individual. For 21 years, Susan Billig was tormented by a man who repeatedly phoned her, claiming he had Amy, and graphically describing supposed acts he did to her. Disturbingly, he would be actively engaging with himself while tormenting Susan, while she would try to record every detail he gave. This caller, who gave the name Johnson, would taunt Susan for years, often calling from untraceable payphones and keeping her in constant anguish. The family couldn't change their phone number because they wanted Amy to be able to call home if she escaped from her captors. Further, just to show how psychologically manipulative this caller was, he would claim that Amy was still alive and captive. In essence, on the off chance he was telling the truth, she needed to sit through his sick games in hopes he slipped up. In 1995, the FBI finally traced one of these calls and unmasked the culprit, Henry Johnson Blair, a U.S. Customs Service agent. Blair was arrested and admitted he had derived physical pleasure from cruelly tormenting Amy's family, though he insisted he knew nothing about her actual fate. He was convicted of stalking and served 2 years in prison. Later, an eerie coincidence emerged. Amy's diary, written weeks before she vanished, mentioned a man named Hank, who'd invited her to South America. Notably, Blair went by the nickname Hank and lived in the area at the time of her disappearance. He also drove a van that was similar to one that Amy had pictures of in some undeveloped film in her room. However, No direct evidence ever linked Blair to the disappearance beyond his decades of cruel phone harassment. A major break in the case finally came 24 years later, though it brought more horror than relief. In 1998, Miami police announced they had received a confession from a dying man. Paul Branch, the Pagans biker who had reached out to Susan years before, was on his deathbed in late 1997 and allegedly confessed to his wife that Amy had been abducted. But this time the story was much different, and he said that she had been slain the very day she was taken. According to Branch's confession, members of the Pagans Motorcycle Club picked up Amy as she hitchhiked and took her to a party at their clubhouse in the Florida Everglades. There, the gang assaulted her. Branch claimed that roughly 24 bikers engaged in horrific acts against Amy. When she resisted the advances of this group, they injected her with a substance to make her docile. When she kept fighting back, they kept administering doses of this unknown substance until she ultimately perished. Afterwards, the bikers disposed of her body in an alligator-infested swamp, where Branch believes that her body was consumed by the animals. One detective on the case said Branch's wife provided numerous details that matched confidential aspects of the investigation, lending credibility to the gruesome story. However, without physical evidence or identified perpetrators to charge, the authorities couldn't confirm the allegations and close out the case definitively. This story does have some problems, however, given the number of credible and verified sightings of Amy in the weeks following the abduction. The fact that she was seen months later purchasing vegetarian food while in the company of a biker gang makes it seem that Branch may not have been telling the truth in his confession. However, that said, since the confession was filtered through his wife and Branch was no longer alive, this may explain the discrepancies. She may have simply misunderstood the timeline he was trying to convey, or he may have been unclear on the timeline himself. Personally, though, I still have to wonder about the connection with Hank, the man who called and harassed the family for 20 years. He claimed not to know who Amy was, but by the time 20 years had passed, there would have been no paper trail on his end to prove it. Amy's mention of an individual called Hank who wanted to take her away just weeks prior suggests something more to me. Further, I find it highly suspicious that this Hank from the diary never came forward to help the investigation if he wasn't involved. Still, this doesn't provide an explanation for why Amy was seen in the company of the bikers. Unfortunately for Amy's remaining family members, the authorities are no closer to cracking her case today than the day she disappeared. I personally think that nothing out of Branch can be trusted. After all, he's a confirmed liar who led on Amy's parents with promises of returning her. He was either lying about the initial story or lying about the disturbing story at the clubhouse. On a chilly day in February 1971, two hitchhikers traveling along Interstate 75 in Central Florida made a gruesome discovery beneath the Lake Panasoffkee overpass. In the shallow waters of Shady Brook Creek beneath that bridge lay the body of a young woman, badly decomposed after roughly a month in the water. A man's leather belt was still wrapped around her neck, and it appeared her body had been bundled up and dropped from the overpass into the marsh below. With no identification on the victim, authorities dubbed her Little Miss Lake Panasoffkee, after the nearby lake. For more than half a century, that nickname was all anyone knew her by, as law enforcement struggled to uncover her identity until now. Local law enforcement in Sumter County started investigating immediately, but identifying the victim proved difficult with 1971's limited forensic tools. The woman appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s, small in stature with dark hair and brown eyes. She was found wearing distinctive green clothing, plaid pants, a matching shirt, and a floral patterned shawl, along with a gold necklace, a ring, and a Baylor wristwatch. These details were carefully recorded, and police circulated descriptions nationwide, yet no missing person report matched the victim. An autopsy confirmed she had been strangled with the belt, likely weeks before her discovery. Heartbreakingly, examiners also determined that the young woman had given birth to children in the past. Somewhere, it seemed, she had family who didn't know what had become of her. Despite extensive effort, the early investigation yielded no leads. The unknown woman was laid to rest in a local cemetery as a Jane Doe, her grave marker bearing the placeholder name that the community had given her. Over the next several decades, investigators refused to let the Little Miss Lake Panisofsky case be forgotten. In 1986, her remains were exhumed to take advantage of improved forensic techniques. Specialists re-examined her bones and teeth, confirming the victim's general profile and noting signs of prior medical care, such as dental work and a healed ankle surgery. Critically, they reaffirmed that she had given birth to at least 2 children, a clue that could have narrowed searches, yet still no identity was found. In 1992, the case was featured on the show Unsolved Mysteries, bringing national attention to the story. For those of you who are unaware of what a cultural phenomenon this show was at the time, the first run of an episode would be watched by 10 million households in North America. Tips came in and police compared countless missing persons cases, but no match emerged. Incredibly, at least one family member watched the Unsolved Mysteries episode without realizing it was about their missing relative. In 2006, they submitted the victim's fingerprints to the FBI's national database, hoping she might have a record, but no hits turned up at the time. By the late 2000s, the team turned to advanced DNA testing and genetic genealogy. Unfortunately, her DNA was in poor condition and produced no useful matches. One scientific analysis even suggested the victim may have spent her childhood in Greece, based on isotope clues in her remains. This led investigators down a frustrating false trail, theorizing she could have been a recent immigrant. Despite all these efforts, the young woman's name remained unknown as the case approached its 55th year. Then the breakthrough finally came in 2025, not from genetic genealogy, but from fingerprints. The Sumter County Sheriff's Office had acquired a cutting-edge fingerprint matching system that uses artificial intelligence to compare degraded fingerprints to complete copies. In October 2025, the system returned a stunning result, a match to fingerprints from a 1970 arrest in Hillsborough County, Florida. After 54 years, Little Miss Lake Panisofsky suddenly had a name. The arrest record identified her as Cookie Rowan, who had been booked in 1970 on a minor charge involving a bad check. Investigators quickly confirmed that the fingerprints and all other details matched the long unidentified victim. In late October 2025, Sheriff Patrick Breeden announced that the mystery of her identity was solved. At a press conference, Sheriff Breeden declared that Little Miss Lake Panisofsky finally had a name, as he revealed Cookie's identity to the world. It was a triumphant and emotional moment for the cold case team and the community. Cookie Rowan turned out to be a 21-year-old local woman and mother, and hadn't grown up in Greece. Tellingly, she had never even been reported missing back in 1971, a fact that helps explain why identification was so difficult. Ironically, the key to identifying her had been in law enforcement files for years. Her fingerprints were uploaded to the FBI database in 2013, long after the initial search. However, until this new cutting-edge technology could compare the degraded fingerprint from her body to the perfect print taken by the cops, the connection couldn't be made. And honestly, it's kind of interesting to see ultra-high-tech forensic solutions that don't involve forensic genetic genealogy once in a while. Once her identity was confirmed, a fuller picture of Cookie Rowan emerged. She was born and raised in the United States and had never even been to Greece, proving that isotope analysis can be problematic. By age 21, Cookie was the mother of 2 young children. She lived in the Tampa area and had married Charles Emery Rowan. However, Cookie's personal life was troubled. Her marriage was reportedly tumultuous, and she had separated from her husband shortly before she disappeared. The exact circumstances around her disappearance are still hazy. Those close to her may not have realized she was truly missing, and some have speculated that a narrative may have been spun by the perpetrator that she abandoned her children. Her now grown children and other relatives finally learned what happened to their long-lost mother. In a public statement, the family expressed deep gratitude to the investigators and the community who never gave up. Identifying Cookie answered the biggest question in the Lake Panasoffkee case, but the mystery isn't entirely over. Investigators also identified a person of interest in her slaying: her estranged husband, Charles Emery Rowan. Emery Rowan would have been 85 years old in 2025, and he died in 2015, taking any secrets he had to the grave. While he can never be formally charged or interrogated, detectives suspect he may have been involved in Cookie's death given the circumstances and their history together. The case remains open as an active investigation, with authorities continuing to gather information about Cookie's final days and anyone who might have been responsible. Personally, I hope the authorities keep digging on this one, since while there is an incredibly obvious suspect, the details of her disappearance are presently unknown. For instance, it's always possible that Cookie had entered into a new relationship after the separation, and this completely unknown person may be responsible. That said, though, I think the most obvious explanation is likely that her former spouse did it and then claimed she left the state and abandoned her children. This may be why her own family members never ended up bringing her case to the authorities. In the early 1980s, a small Colorado publisher released a book that read like a how-to guide for aspiring professionals. It was called Hitman, a technical manual for independent contractors, a slim volume promising to craft the reader into a true pro. Hitman was published in 1983 by Paladin Press, a niche publisher based in Boulder known for its edgy catalog of survival guides, combat manuals, and other forbidden knowledge. The book is presented entirely straight-faced as an instructional manual for less than legal aspiring contract workers. Across its 130 pages, it lays out step-by-step advice on how to enter the business of slaying for hire and get away with it. The author, writing with an authoritative tone, covers everything from selecting a suitable weapon to stalking a target's daily routine. The manual explains how to deal with potential complications, how to avoid leaving evidence, and even how to mislead investigators. The name on the cover, Rex Farrell, was clearly a pseudonym. Translated loosely from Latin, it means Savage King, an appropriately menacing moniker for a purported professional assassin. But the true identity behind that name remained a mystery for many years. The book offered no author biography or credentials beyond the implication that the writer was an experienced hitman, sharing hard-earned secrets from the field. This mystique led some readers to believe they were learning from a genuine pro or someone with special forces training, while others suspected it was all an elaborate hoax to sell books. In time, details about the real author began to surface, adding a surprising twist to the story. According to later media investigations, the author was a woman with no record of violence or military background. She was described as a divorced mom living in Florida who had simply done her research and exercised a dark imagination. Rather than drawing on personal criminal experience, she had built the book's instructions by piecing together information from crime novels, movies, and interviews. In other words, Hitman was essentially a work of fiction packaged as fact. Or at least that's what the official story has been. But digging a bit below the surface, no one has actually shown the receipts on this issue. Notably, the author's identity was kept anonymous as Paladin Press refused to reveal her name or provide any details beyond her being a true crime mom with an active imagination. However, some speculate that Paladin's claim was actually a cover story, attempting to pass the work off as fiction to avoid liability. The line of reasoning is simple. This would have transformed the book from a literal how-to manual into a dark crime novel. The entire thing, including the marketing, would be a form of literary and artistic expression, rather than a literal guide for quote-unquote independent contractors. It would make the publishing of the book essentially the equivalent to producing and broadcasting an episode of Dexter. Unfortunately, whatever the truth about the author, the book would go on to have dire physical consequences. For years, Hitman existed in a sort of twilight zone, widely considered tasteless and extreme, but seemingly harmless in the sense that no known crimes had been directly linked to it. That changed on March 3, 1993, when a brutal triple slaying in Maryland suddenly cast a harsh spotlight on the book. On that day, a man named James Perry entered a home in Silver Spring, Maryland, and carried out an act that was as methodical as it was horrifying. Perry had been hired by Lawrence Horn, a disturbed father locked in a bitter dispute over money with his ex-wife. Horn stood to gain a large trust fund inheritance if his disabled son and the boy's mother were dead, a motive straight out of a crime novel, except it was all too real. Under Horn's direction, James Perry drove from out of state and invaded the Horn family's home. Inside, Perry ended 3 people with chilling precision, with Mildred, Trevor, and Janice Saunders, Trevor's full-time nurse, all perishing that night. In the aftermath, investigators found the scene curiously professional in its approach, the kind of meticulous, detached work that seemed uncommon for an ordinary criminal. Given the significant wealth associated with the Horn family and the bitter dispute, the authorities suspected the husband may have had a guy on retainer. It wasn't long before detectives uncovered a trail leading back to James Perry. What truly stunned them was the discovery that Perry owned a copy of Hitman and had apparently used it as his blueprint. Phone records and receipts showed Perry had ordered the book, along with a guide to building silencers, from Paladin Press prior to the slayings. As the case developed, evidence mounted that Perry followed the manual's advice in exacting detail. Perry had essentially acted out the pages of Hitman, turning theory into reality. Both James Perry and Lawrence Horn were eventually caught and convicted, and Horn was identified as the mastermind, and Perry as the triggerman who committed them. In 1995, relatives of Mildred Horn, Trevor Horn, and Janice Saunders filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Paladin Press. They argued that Hitman was not protected speech, but rather a form of criminal facilitation. Their claim was essentially that Paladin Press, by publishing the manual and knowingly selling it to customers like Perry, shared responsibility for the slayings. This legal argument was virtually unheard of in American courts. Never before had a book publisher been sued for providing instructions that a reader used it to commit such an offense. Paladin Press's defense leaned heavily on the First Amendment. Their lawyers contended that however distasteful Hitman might be, it was a published work of information and was thus safeguarded by free speech precedent. Initially, this argument found traction, and they were successful at getting the case summarily dismissed without a trial. In 1996, a federal judge acknowledged that the book was disturbing and improper. but nevertheless dismissed the lawsuit on First Amendment grounds. He reasoned that written instructions, in and of themselves, didn't constitute a direct incitement to imminent violence under established legal standards. Paladin's victory at that stage seemed to affirm the traditional stance that even the most objectionable speech is protected unless it very explicitly incites a crime. However, the story didn't end there. The victims' families appealed, and in 1997 the case reached the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. In a landmark decision, the appellate judges reversed the earlier ruling. They concluded that Hitman went beyond abstract advocacy of violence. It was effectively aiding and abetting crime by providing detailed practical instructions specifically intended for criminals. The court noted that Paladin Press had even stipulated that they marketed the book to people contemplating crimes. Further, they marketed complementary materials which an aspiring troublemaker could utilize in concert with the instructions given by the author of Hitman. This was a crucial point. Unlike a political manifesto or a violent movie, Hitman was part of an entire apparatus set up by Paladin Press to facilitate the establishment of these services. To go back to the Dexter analogy, imperfect as it is, imagine you're watching the show and all the advertising is intentionally for items which Dexter uses on the show. And not only that, the ads explicitly state that you should buy the items to do what you see being done on screen. With the appellate decision, the matter was kicked back to the lower courts for a trial, which would ultimately never occur. Facing the prospect of a trial by jury and potentially enormous damages, Paladin Press's insurance company chose to settle the case in 1999. Paladin Press agreed to cease publication of Hitman permanently and to destroy any remaining copies in its inventory. Notably, since the matter never went to trial and was settled out of court, Paladin Press was never actually compelled to produce who the author was. Whether Rex Farrell was a true crime mom with a vivid imagination or an actual pro with real know-how will likely remain an unsolved mystery. Tammy Lynn Leppert was a promising young actress and model, best known for a small but very memorable role in one of the most iconic scenes in Scarface. Born on February 5, 1965 in Rockledge, Florida, Tammy began her journey into the limelight at the age of 4, participating in beauty pageants. As she transitioned into her teenage years, Tammy expanded her horizons into modeling and acting. She graced the cover of CoverGirl magazine in October 1978 and landed minor roles in films such as Little Darlings in 1980 and Spring Break in 1983. Her most notable appearance was in the 1983 classic Scarface, where she played the girl who distracts the lookout during the infamous chainsaw scene. However, in early 1983, those close to Tammy noticed a stark change in her behavior. After attending a weekend party following the Spring Break shoot, she returned home noticeably different. Her close friend, Wing Flanagan, observed that she came back a different person. This shift became more evident during the filming of Scarface, where she abruptly left after the 4th day. Her mother, Linda Curtis, believed Tammy was overtaken by a delusion that someone intended to harm her. Concerned, Linda had Tammy undergo a 72-hour observation at a medical center, but doctors reportedly found no signs of any mental health concerns or of substance use. On July 6, 1983, Tammy left her home in Rockledge, Florida, with a male friend, informing her mother that she was heading to the beach and would return shortly. Her friend later told authorities that they had an argument while driving, leading him to leave her in a parking lot near the Glass Bank in Cocoa Beach. Despite being the last known person to see her, he wasn't considered a suspect, though Tammy's mother maintained that he ought to have been. In the aftermath of her disappearance, investigators explored various leads. One theory involved Christopher Wilder, an Australian-born serial perpetrator linked to the slayings of several women across the United States. Wilder's modus operandi included luring women with promises of modeling opportunities, which aligned with Tammy's background. Tammy's family even filed a lawsuit against Wilder, but it was eventually dropped due to doubts about his involvement. Moreover, Wilder's known spree began a year after Tammy vanished, making his connection to her case tenuous. Another potential suspect was John Brennan Crutchley, infamously known as the Vampire. Crutchley was convicted of kidnapping a woman in Orlando, Florida, during which he drained and consumed her life essence. While he was considered a possible suspect in Tammy's case, authorities found no concrete evidence linking him to her disappearance. Crutchley had the good sense to take out the trash while serving life in prison in 2002. Linda Curtis had her own theory, believing that Tammy was abducted and slain due to her knowledge of a large-scale criminal operation in Brevard County, Florida. According to Linda, this operation involved many prominent local citizens, and Tammy's paranoia stemmed from her awareness of these illicit activities. However, investigators found no records to support this claim and didn't endorse this theory. Others have speculated that Tammy witnessed something horrific at a Hollywood party, which caused her to have a mental break. Under this theory, this mental break and her subsequent behavior made her a liability to powerful people, and they had her eliminated. In 1985, 2 years after Tammy's disappearance, Cocoa Beach detective Harold Lewis received 2 anonymous phone calls from a woman claiming that Tammy was alive. The caller also mentioned that Tammy was pursuing her dream of becoming a nurse. Despite these calls, no further evidence surfaced to confirm Tammy's whereabouts, and there's nothing to indicate that these calls were based in reality. Personally, I don't put too much stock in this call because there's always been deranged people out there who like to try to insert themselves into high-profile cases. For 2 centuries, residents and visitors in Florida have exchanged stories of a mysterious ape-like creature lurking in the state's swamplands. Dubbed the skunk ape for its famously foul odor, this creature is often described as the Sunshine State's answer to Bigfoot. Witnesses claim the bipedal beast stands anywhere from 5 to 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy hair, and exudes an unbearable stench likened to rotten eggs or worse. Tales of wild man-apes in Florida stretch back to the early 19th century. As early as 1818, local newspapers in the Florida Panhandle reported encounters with a prowling man-sized monkey said to raid food stores and stalk fishermen near the town of Apalachicola. Some enthusiasts have even attempted to link the creature to Seminole legends of a foul-smelling creature called the Esti Kapakaki, which is translated as hairy giant. Scattered reports of an ape-like being continued into the early 20th century. For example, there's a 1940s account which tells of a tall man-like creature covered in hair leaping onto a truck's running board in Suwannee County. These early stories, as well as indigenous folklore, have set the stage for what would arguably become Florida's most famous cryptid. The skunk ape legend truly gained traction from the mid-20th century onwards. Eyewitness stories picked up significantly from the 1950s through the 1970s, coinciding with increased development of Florida's wilderness areas. During this era, sightings of a large, smelly ape man in the Everglades and surrounding regions became so common that they garnered widespread newspaper coverage. It was around this time that the colorful moniker skunk ape entered popular use, thanks to reports describing the creature's pungent odor and skunk-like stench. By the early 1970s, multiple witnesses in South Florida were alleging that the creature had invaded rural homes, chased hikers, and even eaten livestock. The wave of sightings was taken quite seriously by some. In 1977, Florida State Representative Paul Nuckols went so far as to propose a law to protect the creature from harm. The bill sought to criminalize the capturing or harming of any anthropoid or humanoid animal in Florida. Although this so-called skunk ape bill ultimately failed to pass, its introduction underscored how deeply the legend had permeated Florida's imagination by the late 1970s. Notably, Knuckles faced a great deal of criticism for the bill. However, he wasn't necessarily a believer in the creature. Rather, he just wanted a provision in place to stop skunk ape hunters from blasting one down or imprisoning one, should they exist. Throughout the years, a number of skunk ape encounters have stood out for their notoriety. In one incident in the early 1970s, two sheriff's deputies in Palm Beach County reported that an ape-like creature stalked them through an orange grove at night. The officers fired their weapons at it, and later found a trail of large footprints along with coarse hair caught on a barbed wire fence. Around the same period, a rash of encounters in counties near the Everglades made headlines when locals described a 5 to 7 foot tall, red-haired ape. This hominid was said to wander onto porches and even allegedly slaughtered farm animals and pets. Gangs of concerned citizens formed to hunt down the beast, and a patrol officer claimed to have struck it with his vehicle, yet no corpse or definitive evidence ever turned up. In 1997, a fire chief named Vince Doer was driving through Big Cypress National Preserve when, by his account, a shaggy, oversized figure darted across the road. Doer managed to snap a quick photograph of the tall, hairy creature before it vanished into the swamp. In the 2 weeks after his sighting, more than 50 people came forward, claiming to have seen a similar ape-like being in the area. Just a few years later came one of the most iconic and controversial pieces of skunk ape lore, the Myakka skunk ape photographs. In late 2000, the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office received an anonymous letter from a woman who enclosed startling photos of an ape-like creature partially obscured by palmetto fronds. The letter's author, who never revealed her identity, wrote that the, quote, orangutan had been stealing apples from her backyard, and she worried it might cause a car accident if not caught. The grainy flash photographs showed a large, hairy animal with reflective eyes and prominent fangs, leading many to speculate that this was the elusive skunk ape caught on film. Skeptics, however, noted that without a known photographer or original negatives, the Myakka pictures could easily be a hoax. To this day, the Myakka ape photos remain hotly debated, with some claiming they've been fully debunked, and others believing they depict a real live skunk ape. Numerous theories exist with respect to Florida's answer to the Sasquatch. Believers in the skunk ape contend that these sightings are not simply mistakes or hoaxes, but evidence of an unknown species residing in the remote swamps of the southeast. In the view of many cryptozoologists, the creature is essentially a regional cousin of Bigfoot, a smaller, swamp-dwelling hominid that has adapted to Florida's wetland environment. They point out that Florida's reports share similarities with Sasquatch legends elsewhere, noting that it's also a large bipedal primate that hides effectively from humans. Enthusiasts argue that with so many eyewitness accounts, it's plausible a real, elusive ape could be out there, as yet undocumented by science. Scientists and skeptics, on the other hand, propose more conventional explanations for the skunk ape legend. The simplest theory is misidentification, that purported skunk apes are in fact known animals, seen under unusual circumstances. Florida is home to black bears which can occasionally walk upright for short stints, potentially resembling a hulking ape from a distance. Others have suggested that passing glances at giant feral wild hogs could account for skunk ape sightings. Under this theory, giant feral hogs can represent a gorilla-like creature running or walking on its knuckles. Perhaps the most interesting skeptical theory on the skunk ape isn't that it doesn't exist, but that it's actually an escaped great ape, such as an orangutan. Personally, I find this idea the most interesting, though perhaps that's because I associate Florida with people owning exotic animals in private zoos and collections. On January 24th, 1984, 19-year-old Timothy Michael Molnar vanished under circumstances that continue to baffle investigators and his family. A dedicated student at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida, Tim was known for his punctuality and commitment to his family and education. That morning, he dropped off his 14-year-old brother, Frank, at school and was expected to attend his classes thereafter. However, instead of heading to the university, Tim returned home, loaded his bicycle into his 1969 Dodge Dart, and drove away, never to be seen alive again. When Tim didn't return home that evening, his parents immediately sensed something was amiss. He was known for adhering to his routines, and any deviation was unusual. Concerned, they contacted his friends and the local authorities, but no one had any information about his whereabouts. That night, the family received 2 unsettling phone calls with only silence on the other end, leading them to wonder if Tim was trying to reach out, but was unable to speak. Weeks later, a clue emerged when the Molnar family received a credit card bill indicating a purchase at a gas station in Lake City, Florida, made on the day of Tim's disappearance. The gas station attendant recalled Tim refueling alone, which intensified speculations about his intentions. Further investigation revealed that Tim had withdrawn nearly all his savings, leaving just $10 in his account. The fact that he left $10 in the account has been theorized by some to indicate that he intended to keep this account open and active. According to this theory, Tim may have been planning on returning to his regular life. Otherwise, he would have just withdrawn it all. 4 months after his disappearance, another lead surfaced. The family received a letter from a car repossession company in Atlanta, Georgia. The letter stated that Tim's Dodge Dart had been found abandoned in a parking lot just a block away from the Greyhound bus station, 6 days after he vanished. Inside the car, his driver's license, wallet, credit card, and other personal items were discovered, but his bicycle, stereo system, and an expensive toolkit were missing. Despite these developments, years passed without any significant breakthroughs. In 1996, over a decade after Tim's disappearance, a viewer named Stephen Cull was watching an episode of Unsolved Mysteries that featured Tim's case. Cull recognized the clothing shown in the episode as matching those found on a body he had discovered frozen in ice in a remote woodlot near Neosho, Wisconsin, 10 years earlier. He contacted the medical examiner, who still had a set of keys found with the deceased. When the Molnar family provided a copy of their house key, it matched one of the keys in evidence. DNA testing ultimately confirmed the remains were indeed Tim's, putting to rest any doubts. The discovery of Tim's body in Wisconsin, nearly 1,500 miles from his home, raised more questions than answers. The cause of death couldn't be determined due to the condition of the remains, but there were no signs of trauma. How and why Tim ended up in such a remote location remains a mystery. Friends and family found it particularly perplexing that he had left his cherished car behind, as he was known to be very proud of it. Tim's story is as tragic as it is baffling. At 19, he was right on the cusp of adulthood, a time when responsibilities grow heavier and new pressures can emerge. It's during this late adolescent or early adult period that mental health crises can strike, and at times, without much warning. Could Tim have experienced some type of psychological breakdown that prompted his sudden exit? The abrupt decision to abandon his routine, withdraw nearly all his savings, and leave his cherished car behind might point to a severe internal struggle. All evidence seems to suggest that he was a high-achieving student, and oftentimes the transition from high school to college can be a real mental shock. This could have been the catalyst for some sort of mental break which ultimately led to his demise. Yet foul play clearly can't be dismissed either in this case. Tim's unexpected journey all the way to Wisconsin, where his remains were eventually discovered, leaves a serious sense of foreboding. Did someone manipulate him into traveling so far from home? Could he have encountered danger after voluntarily leaving? There's simply not enough evidence to say. The missing bicycle and tools add a layer of suspicion, hinting that someone else might have been involved. While researching the case, I saw it mentioned on an old forum that he may have been hitchhiking after abandoning his vehicle. One theory is that he may have been picked up by the wrong person, who eliminated him. Another angle is the possibility of a secret life. Sometimes people, especially young adults feeling boxed in by expectations, contemplate escape. Perhaps Tim had aspirations or connections that he kept hidden, leading him to venture off on his own. Unfortunately, given that this occurred in the days before the mass adoption of computer technology and before the internet, we have no insight into any potential hidden motives. The fact he left $10 in his bank account suggests he might have intended to return to his regular life, indicating at least some thoughtfulness to his departure. Ultimately, we may never fully understand Tim's last days. His case is an enduring mystery, one that reflects how a single choice or a single tragedy can alter a life's course forever. On a warm August evening in 2010, 30-year-old Ben McDaniel slipped into the clear waters of Vortex Spring in Florida for a solo cave dive. As dusk fell, he swam toward a submerged passage blocked by a metal grate, passing a Grim Reaper sign that cautioned divers nothing beyond was worth dying for. Despite lacking cave diving certification, Ben pushed past the gate into the cave's depths. He never returned to the surface. Extensive searches of the underwater labyrinth found no trace of him, and even 15 years later, his fate remains unknown. Ben McDaniel loved scuba diving from a young age, but by his late 20s, a string of personal setbacks had upended his life. Ben grew up in Tennessee, where he started diving as a teenager and even ran a successful construction business for a time. But in the late 2000s, he endured a painful divorce and the collapse of that business, which left him with tens of thousands of dollars in debt to the IRS. Worse, in 2008, his younger brother died suddenly at age 22, a tragedy that devastated Ben and left him grief-stricken. In 2010, hoping to help him heal, Ben's parents invited him to take an extended break at their beach house on the Florida Panhandle. Ben relocated to Santa Rosa Beach with his dog and soon became a regular at Vortex Spring, a popular freshwater dive site about an hour away. Immersing himself in daily dives, he told friends he was mapping the spring's underwater cave system and working toward becoming a certified dive instructor. Although he didn't have the required certification to go into the caves, Ben reportedly pushed the limits by exploring the Vortex Spring Cave whenever he could. On August 18, 2010, Ben spent much of the day scuba diving at Vortex Spring and updating his dive log with observations. That evening, he spoke by phone with his mom, then geared up for one last dive just before sunset. As Ben descended into the spring, 2 employees noticed him heading toward the cave entrance. They knew Ben as an avid visitor and suspected he was intent on venturing into the off-limits section of the cave. In fact, one of the employees later admitted he thought Ben had been trying to bypass the locked gate inside the cave, so he used his own key to unlock it for Ben. With the gate open, Ben swam into the winding tunnels beyond the warning signs, undeterred by the danger. When Ben failed to resurface later that night, no one on shore immediately realized something was wrong. Vortex Spring is a busy spot, and his pickup truck remained parked unnoticed for 2 days, with no one apparently noticing it. On August 20th, employees finally grew alarmed that Ben's truck hadn't moved and called the Holmes County Sheriff's Office. Deputies arrived and treated the area as a potential accident scene, even roping it off with police tape while rescue divers were called in. Ben's wallet, cell phone, and detailed dive logs were found in his truck, along with a hand-drawn map of the cave system he'd been exploring. An intensive search and recovery effort began. Veteran cave divers from across the region converged on Vortex Spring, fully aware of its reputation. Notably, over a dozen divers had lost their lives in this cave in prior years. The cave's layout is complex and perilous. The entrance is 50 feet underwater, and beyond the unlocked gate, the passages narrow to squeezes as small as 10 inches high. Despite those challenges, teams of experts methodically scoured all accessible areas. Early in the search, they found 2 of Ben's decompression tanks just inside the cave entrance. He had left them there for his return trip, a normal practice, but oddly, the tanks were filled only with regular air instead of a specialized gas mix. Apart from those tanks, divers discovered nothing else that belonged to Ben. They pushed into every crevice they could reach, but came up empty. No body, no additional gear, not even a scrape mark on the cave walls or any disturbed silt. Searchers also pointed out that at 6 feet 1 inch tall and around 210 pounds, Ben's build would have made it nearly impossible for him to navigate portions of the cave. The McDaniel family even funded advanced search measures. A remotely operated submarine was sent into passages too narrow for humans, and the water was tested for any evidence of human decomposition. Interestingly, all these signs came up negative, suggesting the possibility that Ben hadn't perished in the cave at all. As months and years passed with no answers, several theories emerged to explain Ben McDaniel's fate. His parents put up a large financial reward for anyone who was able to recover his body, but unfortunately this led to another tragedy. A diver who had come from Mississippi to claim the bounty perished while he was searching for Ben's remains. This led to Ben's parents to withdraw the reward money and urge that no further attempts be undertaken. Ben's parents and many divers believe he drowned in an unmapped, unreachable section of the cave, effectively hiding his remains. Some even suggest his body could be slowly entombed by sand and silt, further concealing Ben's body, though this doesn't explain why no evidence of decomposition was found. Others speculate that he staged his own disappearance to escape financial, marital, and personal troubles, or may have fallen victim to foul play. By 2013, with no breakthroughs, Florida issued a death certificate declaring Ben McDaniel legally dead. On a warm Sunday evening in July 2015, 28-year-old tech visionary Josh Greenberg was discovered lifeless in his Gainesville, Florida home. Greenberg was the co-founder of the once popular music streaming service Grooveshark, a pioneer of online music sharing that had just shut down amid legal battles. Josh Greenberg was a driven innovator and a beloved figure in his hometown. Born in 1987, Greenberg grew up in Florida and attended the University of Florida in Gainesville. It was there, as an undergraduate in 2006, that he teamed up with 2 classmates to create Grooveshark. Greenberg served as chief technology officer, shaping the platform's technical vision. He also engaged in other ventures, co-founding a software startup and helping launch a local coding academy to train aspiring programmers. Energetic and passionate, Greenberg aimed to transform Gainesville into a place where startups could thrive. He was known for mentoring younger entrepreneurs and giving back generously. Grooveshark began as a scrappy student project, but quickly grew into a massive online music platform. Launched in the mid-2000s, it allowed users to upload and stream music for free, putting virtually any song at their fingertips. This YouTube for music approach filled a niche in the pre-Spotify era. Before long, Grooveshark amassed over 35 million users worldwide at its peak. The startup punched above its weight, even attracting major advertisers and reportedly generating tens of millions in revenue despite minimal funding. For a time, Greenberg and his team rode high as music streaming pioneers, turning their college experiment into a global service. Grooveshark became a popular name among tech-savvy music lovers, and its success put Gainesville on the map as an unlikely tech hub. Yet the very feature that made Grooveshark popular, letting users upload any music, also made it controversial. Unlike licensed platforms, Grooveshark didn't initially pay royalties for much of its vast song library. The young founders insisted they operated within the law, citing that they were just a hosting platform, but many in the music industry vehemently disagreed. Critics accused Grooveshark of building a business on pirated content and cheating artists out of earnings. Despite warnings, the platform managed to attract millions of users and high-profile sponsors, even as record labels grew increasingly alarmed. By the early 2000s, Grooveshark was embroiled in a protracted legal battle with the major record companies. Universal Music Group, Sony Music, and Warner Music joined forces to sue the startup for massive copyright infringement damages. The litigation dragged on for 4 years, casting a shadow over Grooveshark's future. In April 2015, facing the risk of crippling penalties, Greenberg and his co-founders agreed to an out-of-court settlement. This deal allowed Grooveshark to avoid potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in fines had the case gone to trial. They shut down Grooveshark's website and, in a public letter to users, apologized for the mistakes of not securing proper music licenses. A court order soon followed in May 2015, forcing the service to stay closed and its parent company to pay $50 million to rights holders. It was the end of Grooveshark's 8-year run. The closure of Grooveshark was a bitter moment, but those closest to Josh Greenberg say he made peace with it. Having finally resolved the lawsuit that had loomed over him for years, Greenberg was surprisingly upbeat. According to his mother, he felt more relieved than defeated after shutting down the company. He had already begun turning his attention to new opportunities, carrying on with the positive attitude he was known for in Gainesville's startup scene. Less than 3 months after Grooveshark's demise, tragedy struck. On July 19, 2015, Josh Greenberg's girlfriend returned from a weekend trip and found him unresponsive in their bed. A day earlier, he had seemed perfectly healthy, so this loss came without any warning. Police investigators were baffled. There were no signs of foul play whatsoever, but nor did the evidence suggest he did it to himself. It appeared that Greenberg simply died in his sleep, making his death all the more perplexing. An autopsy was performed, but the initial results found nothing conclusive. Greenberg had been physically healthy, and examiners saw no injuries or obvious medical conditions. Toxicology tests later revealed only trace amounts of common substances, with nothing that could explain his death. In the official report, the cause of death remained unknown. The promising life of Josh Greenberg had ended as suddenly and mysteriously as a light switched off. News of Greenberg's untimely death sent shockwaves through his family, friends, and colleagues. Those closest to Josh were adamant on one point: this wasn't something he did himself. Despite the heartbreaking end of Grooveshark, everyone around him attested that he had been in good spirits throughout the summer of 2015. He was optimistic, excited about future projects, and finally free from the burden of litigation. His mother, Lori, stressed that she saw no signs of depression or despair in her son, reinforcing that he was looking forward to the next stage of his life. Investigators agreed. They found no evidence that Greenberg had intentionally hurt himself, just as they found no hint of any intruder or foul play in his home. Years later, the exact cause of Josh Greenberg's death remains an unsolved mystery. It's a haunting reminder that life can be unpredictable and fragile, even for someone seemingly young and healthy.